Hello. I'm hoping you can hear me. This is the first time I've done a Facebook live kind of Q&A session, so please do pop something in the chat, just for my own peace of mind that all is good. Okay, we've got quite a few viewers already. Ian said hello. Thank you, Ian. Right. Okay. Let's see how we're doing. Yeah, it's looking pretty good. Okay, I'm going to start off by telling you a little bit. I just want to introduce myself, by the way. I'm Martin Long. I have been one of the kind of early adopters of the Wolfmix W1, had it for about a year. I've also been asked to be a Wolfmix ambassador, which is pretty cool. So you'll find some details about me on the Wolfmix page, webpage. I'm going to just talk through briefly about how I got started with this, and hopefully it will give you some ideas and some tips on how to get your Wolfmix doing what you want it to do, because it's kind of different for everyone, and it all depends on the lighting fixtures that you're using. Right, okay. In fact, let me just talk about lighting fixtures for a moment, because they come in many flavours, and the Wolfmix is designed to control some of them extremely well, and some of them with a bit more effort. I'm just going to chuck a few things your way. So something like parkans, right? These guys are really easy. These happen to be hex parkans, but anything kind of RGBW will work perfectly with the Wolfmix. So if you're using these, I'll show you exactly how to get these up and running very quickly. If you're using something like moving heads, so I've got here a simple kind of moving head spot. This has a rotating gobos. It has a prism. Doesn't have focus, automatic focus on this, but I know some fixtures do. But most importantly, as a moving head, it has a couple of really important traits. It has pan and tilt, i.e. so be able to kind of rotate and also tip. It has a colour wheel. This one has a colour wheel, not RGB, as Parkans do. And it's got some features that the Wolfmix can control kind of natively, and it also has some features that you can use via some of its kind of more advanced capability, particularly things like live edits. I will briefly touch on those. So that's kind of typical moving heads. I've also got some of these guys. Now these is an Equinox Vortex. These are quite interesting because they've got pad and tilt, but they've also got some kind of unusual features. So this has got a continuous rotating LEDs and zoom. So you may be wondering, if you've got fixtures like this, how do you get the best out of these? How do you get to access things like zoom when there's no obvious buttons on here on the W1 for zoom? I've got some of them more complex. Now, a couple of people have been talking to me today about fixtures a bit like this. I've got a couple of ADJ Warlocks. I've also got these little mini deckers. Now, these are pretty cool, but they don't have pan and they don't have tilt. These do have RGB. They do use RGB, but they're a little bit more difficult to control. But you absolutely can. And if we get there today, I will show you a little bit about how to get the best out of fixtures like this. Same goes for stuff like these guys. Now, if you've got something like this can you see this? This is a Starburst. Now these, again, they have a kind of pan, but the manual calls it rotation. So that's a little bit different. These are kind of RGB fixtures, but they're a little bit more unusual. Can the Wolfmix control these? Absolutely, yeah. I'll try and get to that as well. Right, the last one I'm going to pick up and show you is something like this. Now, I use these, or used to, for kids' parties. They're brilliant. These are Stinger 2s, but the challenge with these is it's more like 3 fixtures in one. So you've got a typical kind of rotating mirror with RGB output. You've got a laser in the centre, which there's Wolfmix, there's no mention of lasers in here, and it's also got these kind of odd little UV dots around the outside. So much harder to control. They are possible, but we'll talk about these. If you're using these multi-effects boxes, you're probably going to struggle to start with. keep it simple, and let's look at some of the easier ones first. Right, okay, grab. Let's grab a drink. Whoa. Right. Cool. Having a quick look in the chat. My goodness. Loads of stuff going on. Okay. Right, let's talk about the Wolfmix first of all. I'm going to talk you through a couple of really important things about getting started. So let's switch views here. Okay, so if you've fired up your Wolfmix, so you've got it connected up either to your laptop or to a power supply, doesn't matter. It's going to look a bit like this. I'm just going to talk through how I've set up mine so that I can get the most out of it. This may or may not help you, but at least it will kind of give you a clue as to how I've got it working for me. Now, a couple of things first of all. I've turned off all of the effects. So there's no color effects, no movement effects, and no beam effects for running at all at the moment, because I want to keep it really simple. In terms of my groups, I've put all of my fixtures into 6 groups. I've got Group A, which is just my pars. I'll explain why in a moment. Group B is my moving spots. So that would be things like your typical moving heads, moving spots. I've got a separate group for my moving wash. Group number 4 are barrels. And for that, I think I talk about anything with a kind of a rotating mirror. That could be warlocks, wizards. It could be even things like Equinox, not Equinox, Helix and Obsessions, those kind of things. Those are the first 4. My 5th and 6th groups are pin spots and freedom sticks. I'll probably cover those in a separate session because they're a little bit more complex. Pin spots relatively easy. Freedom sticks, there's a fair bit to that, so we'll save that for another day. So let's talk about what each of these groups mean. So the reason you group fixtures together is because you kind of want them to do the same thing. So I generally always want my pars to be doing what I want them to do, separately from my moving spots. And I also want my moving spots to kind of be able to operate separately from my moving wash. If I put the kind of spots and wash together, then I wouldn't be able to have one of them static and one of them moving. So you need to think about groups in terms of how do you want to control them. Barrels, again, I kind of want to be able to control those independently, so hence they're in a separate group on their own. But I'm also going to just flash up something on the screen that everyone, if you've read the manual, will probably have not looked at, and yet it's really important. So if you've looked at the manual, this is on really early on, probably, I don't know, page 10 or something. This is, you're not going to see me on the screen, by the way, but this is really key because this explains how the Wolfmix W1 actually works. This explains how every 25 milliseconds it decides what it's going to do and how it's going to tell your fixtures what to do. So I said right at the outset that I've turned all of my effects off, so nothing is running at the moment. And essentially what happens is your W1 decides kind of what's the static state, what's the state at which your fixtures are in when it's really not telling them to do anything. So it's not telling them to change color, it's not telling them to move, and it's certainly not telling them to kind of flash beams. My throat's a bit dry, I'm going to have to keep drinking. Right, so first piece of advice from me, if you've just switched it on for the first time and you're trying to make some sense of it all, turn off all the effects, because you don't want your effects to be running and your head's moving around or not, your par cans flashing around or not. You kind of want to know what your kind of static state is. So I'm going to go down the first column and talk about each one of these first. So color. Let's talk about color. So remember, so there's no effects running, right? At this point, no effects. So when your W1 is not telling any of your lights to change color, it's not telling your heads to move, it's not doing anything. So this is kind of its static state. So if you hit the color, this is where you choose the static color for each group. So for group A, remember, was pars. It does say at the top, but it's just hard for you to read. You choose the color you want. So you can choose, by clicking the button, you can change between colors 1 to 5 or 6 to 10. You can edit these colors if you wish, but the ones that kind of come ready out of the box have kind of served me quite well. So for my pars, I've chosen pink. You can either tap the word pink, or you can hit the button, the pad, to change. So at this point, if I had pars in my room, they would be pink. If I hit the blue, cyan, they would be cyan. And if I change from view color 6 to 10, I could click white and they would be white. So that would be the kind of static color. Okay, so first off, you choose the kind of static color that you want to for group A, which is pars. You could do the same thing for moving spots. You choose the static color that you want them to be. So if you don't want them to be moving, i.e. you want them to be still, because you want them focused in a certain position, and you want them to be a particular color, this is where you choose the color for that single kind of static position. So I've chosen magenta here. I could easily choose cyan, amber, switch views, choose white. So if I want my spots to be white, I choose them on this color. Same for my moving wash. Choose the color here. As you can see, I'm a bit of a fan of pink. Barrels, I've chosen a magenta color, and I choose the, one thing I forgot to mention. You would normally switch groups by pressing Shift and BPM tap, but there's a setting that you can change so that rather than having to press Shift and BPM tap, you can just press BPM tap on its own. It's in the manual. You can go and find it if you need to. So you can see groups E and F, and you can see the colours that are being selected here. So for my pin spots, I've just chosen them to be white, and my freedom sticks, I think, are pink. So with no effects running, that's what colour each of those groups should be. And as you can see, you can choose different colours for different groups. So that's colour. Okay, let's go to position. So again, remember, no effects running, so no movement, no colour changing, no beam effects, different flashes, just completely static. So by position, this is where you choose the home or default position for your moving head. So anything that has pan or tilt, you choose the position. So if you there are 10 choices here. You can configure these. You can change the position. So they're named kind of by default. They're called floor, center point, ceiling, etc. But it's kind of up to you to determine where that position is. So for me, I generally have my, you can't see me, I have my DJ booth. I have a couple of moving heads. If I want them to be pointing for a first dance just on the floor, where the bride or groom are doing their first dance, I want to be able to fix that position and be able to kind of recall it here. So if I turn off any movement effects, my moving heads will return to that kind of home position. And in fact, as you can see on screen, I have multiple home positions. So floor, you might be saying, well, where is floor? Well, you hold the Shift and press the button for floor, and you can then use the encoders here to change where your moving heads are pointing. And if they were connected here, they would actually be moving. So if I turn pan, you'll see that the heads would be panning right and panning left. And you have to be fairly gentle with this. If you turn it too quickly, it will move quite rapidly. So that's the pan. This is tilt to determine where they tilt. Fan is really important because fan determines whether or not your heads are pointing in parallel, so kind of both of them directly ahead, or whether they're fanned slightly apart or fanned slightly together. So 50% would be them pointing directly ahead. and a kind of value of 45% is typically pointing inward slightly, and a value of over 50% would be pointing apart slightly. There's also a focus on here, so you can set the focus of any moving heads for a given position. So that's position. Once you set this, you hold Shift and you press the pad again to return, and you can set up multiple fixed positions. So I use floor because I often want my heads to point directly at the floor. I use center to literally be horizontal and just pointing out to the room. Ceiling I use because if I'm in a nice barn, I can point my heads at the ceiling without them. So they're not moving; they're just pointing at the ceiling and projecting the gobos onto the ceiling. And there are others as well, ceiling point, etc. So again, to edit the actual position of each one, you hold Shift and you press the pad to change the actual position. Then you hold Shift and press the pad again to save it. So the last one I'm going to cover is gobo. So gobo is pretty straightforward. Any of your fixtures that have a gobo wheel will have the gobos listed here. So you can select gobos. I happen to have edited this profile so it's got proper names in it, which makes it a little bit easier for me to remember. You can do that on the W1. I may cover that another time. Too much detail for today. So, but this is simply where you choose the static gobo, essentially the gobo that you want your heads to be projecting. I've got my moving spots have a gobo wheel, so I can choose stars, and my barrels, in my case they're warlocks, also have a gobo wheel, so I can choose the gobo wheel in here. And don't forget, this is only showing groups A, B, C, and D. Pressing BPM tap would show groups E, F, G, and H. So we've covered colour. So this is static colour, position, and gobo. So how does that relate to what's on the screen? Well, if you take a look, this is where your W1 decides how to send commands to your fixtures. So the first thing it does, it looks up the default value in each fixture profile for any given channel. It then has an option to take a value from DMX in. I'm not going to cover that, too much detail. And then the next thing it does is it will set the gobo value, and then for any lamps that have either a color, wheel, or RGB, it will set the static color that we just set. And for any fixtures that have pan and or tilt, it will set the position for those fixtures. So what you'll have at this point is all your lights doing what you want them to do, but not moving and not changing color. And that's really important because that's the kind of default position. That's the point at which you can say, right, if I turn on any effects, then I would expect things to happen. And if I turn off effects like changing color, movement, and beams, I would expect my fixtures to return to that static position. That's really important because if you want to create like a first dance scene, for example, where you don't want your heads to be moving and you don't want your uplights to be bouncing around like a fairground, changing colours all the time, then you can set a single colour and a single position, and you just turn off effects, and they'll return to that kind of static state. Kind of hoping this is making sense. Let's go and have a quick check on the chat. Loads of stuff going on. Loads of people asking some questions. So I will come back. Yannick in French. No, I'm afraid not. My French is terrible. So that's really key that we get that kind of basic understanding of the what the W1 does before you start applying effects, because it's really easy to leap in and start hitting the effects buttons and trying to get stuff to happen if you don't really know what the steady state of all of your fixtures are. Okay, so going back to the diagram then, you'll notice that the next thing down in the layer for colour is colour effects, for movement is move effects, and there's a third one introduced now called beam effects. Beam effects is quite complex. I can explain it in a couple of words, but to show you on the W1 it is a bit harder. So I may or may not get to cover that. But color effects and move effects are relatively simple. So hit the home button. So let's now we now know that I've chosen colors for each one of my fixtures. I've fixed them in the position that I want, so they're kind of in a nice steady state and not moving. And I've chosen a gobo. So if I go to color effects now, this is an effects generator. This will create a color effect for all fixtures if you choose to enable color effects. I'll explain what that means in a mo. So there are a number of color effects that you can choose. Some of them have got the same icon. I'm not sure why. Might have to ask Simon that. So why, for example, there's a rainbow here and a rainbow here, but they're different. So they don't do the same things. So this rainbow, I believe, will just bounce between colors. So you can control some of the parameters using the encoders here. So you can set the speed at which the color will change. Phase determines whether all of your fixtures in any given group will change at the same time, or if it will happen over a kind of a phased period. So the first one might change, and then by phase it means the second one will follow, and then the third, and then the fourth, and then the fifth. And you can, if you adjust the phase, and you've got multiple things like LEDs, it will kind of become obvious that you'll see that if you're bouncing between two colors here, and at the moment I don't know whether you can see this, but I've basically got a pink and blue selected from this color pad. So the bottom 4x4 grid here determines the colors that you can select for a color effect. So I've chosen, for simplicity at the moment, for a kind of a first dance scenario, pink and blue. I've set the speed to be quite slow, 15%. That means that's pretty slow. So they're gonna slowly fade between pink and blue. I've set the fade to 100%. That means they will very slowly fade between pink and blue. If I set fade to 0, they would literally go pink, then bing blue, then bing pink. So that means they would change instantly. If I crank the fade right back up again, my pars in this case would fade smoothly and quite slowly between just pink and blue. If I wanted to add something like green in there, I could tap the green, and now my pars, if this effects rack were enabled, would fade between green, pink, and blue. And if I don't want green there, just tap the button. The top row determines whether or not any group is actually being affected by this effects rack. So pars, if I tap the top icon, top pad here, that enables this effect just for my pars. Okay, and if I tap it again, it goes off. You'll notice at the top of the screen it's no longer lit. So that would mean that my pars are no longer fading between green and blue. They've gone back to their original static color, the one that I chose at the beginning, which I think was pink. So if I tap this now, my par cans are saying, right, the effects rack, if you look at the diagram on screen, you'll see that the effects rack for color effects is overriding my static color. So for pars, I'm now saying, ignore static color because I want to override that, and I want you to fade between pink and blue. And I can choose whether any or all of my fixture groups are affected by the color effects. So if I want my moving spots to stay on white, I think it was, but I want my moving wash to follow this pink and blue, I just tap moving wash, or I tap the pad, and this now means that both my pars and my moving wash are being powered by this color effects. So but you can only have one color effect. So there may be lots of options in here, but there's only one color effect active at any one time. If you want to have different color effects for different scenes, as it were, that's when we're going to have to get into presets, because once you've created a scene that you like, so a scene could be no effects selected at all. It could be just your simple first dance, no movement, no color change, nothing at all. You could create a preset that just says, return me to that kind of base first dance position. You could then create multiple presets that will change that. You can have different color effects, all sorts of different effects in any preset. But again, I feel like I'm going to come back to an awful lot of things, but presets are your friend when you've created a scene that you like and you want to store it on a single button so that you can recall kind of all of these parameters at the press of a single button. So back to color effects. There are lots of different items in here. Your best bet is to play with these, find out what they do, get your lights out, which is what I did. Annoy your spouse, partner, whoever. Stick all your lights in the living room, on the dining room table, or do something, and actually look at what these things do, because they all do different things. This is for example, here is a chase from kind of left to right. So if you set up loads of pars, for example, and you literally want them to chase left to right, they can do that. But my advice is play around with these effects to find out what they do. My advice is also to change one thing at a time so that you can see what you're doing and the effect it has on your lights. So back to the kind of diagram then. Anytime that I enable a color effects for a given group, that means that group will no longer use its single static color that I'd previously defined. It's kind of overridden and saying, right, I now want you to, in this case, bounce between blue and pink. And you can select as many colors here as you like. I could switch them all on if I wanted to. So now it would literally fade between all 16 colors. Bit mad, not sure why you do that, but you can. So I'll just turn some of those off. So that's color effects. And most important thing there is remember that you've now overridden your kind of base position, or in this case, base color. So that's color effects. You can also switch on color effects on the home screen. So if you tap home, you'll notice that the color effects icons are lit. You may or may not be able to see that on the screen, but the two blue rows, two buttons here in these columns also show that color effects is enabled. So I can tap them on the screen to switch them off, and you'll notice that the pads go off, or I can tap the two pads and the color effects come on. You can do either, doesn't matter. So that's how you apply a color effect to a specific group, and that also kind of goes some way to explaining why groups are important, because as I mentioned earlier, I might want my pars to be able to, I'm able to be able to control those so that they stay on a static color while my moving wash do something else, or I may want my pars to be able to bounce around all over the place, but my moving wash to be static. So therefore grouping is important, because the groups determine which effects are applied to which fixtures. I'm kind of hoping this is making some sense. Can you apply different color effects to different groups? No. There's only one color effect in force at any time. So once you've defined a color effects, that color effect is will apply to all the groups that are activated. But you can't, for example, have the rainbow color effects on pars and moving wash, but something like the night fever effect on two others. You can't do that because you can only select one of the effects. So that's why I choose my effects carefully, and I also choose the groups that they apply to carefully. Otherwise, you can end up creating a bit of a mess. There may be another reason why you've asked that question, and if there is, you probably want to explain what you're trying to achieve, because very often there is a way to achieve what you're trying to do, but not by the route that you think. So it may be that you want two different color effects, but actually one of the most common things that I do is, as I said, is having things like my parkans on a nice steady color, but my moving wash changing between two colors, and you can do that. That is possible. Okay, can you choose different colors for each group? If you're talking about effects, no. So once you've selected the type of effect at the top, you then choose the colors that are involved. So you could choose pink, blue, green, and white, for example. But those four colors, and this, in this case, it's the night fever. I think it's called night fever. Is always applied to the groups that are selected. So in this case, pars and moving wash have this color effect applied. If I turn it off, none of my groups have this effect being applied. So therefore they'll go back to their kind of static state, whatever color I selected on this color button. Okay, so that's color effects. Let's talk about move effects. So move effects are specifically, I want to say moving heads, but that's not true. Right? Move effects control any fixture that's within its profile has a pan and or a tilt channel. So if, for example, you've got something really simple, like a moving head, I'm going to just turn off the grid for a moment so you can see me. So if you've got a moving head, right, this is really obvious, right? Pan and tilt is really obvious. It's because, you know, it kind of makes sense to you and me. That, you know, that's kind of nice and easy. It's less obvious in something like this, right? Because if you were to dig out the user guide for this, and I've probably got it somewhere, it will the profile for this will describe the movement channel as something like rotation. Okay, rotation is not pan and it's not tilt, so therefore by default the W1 will not move the mirror inside this, because it's simply saying, well, it's not pan, it's not tilt, so I'm not going to use it. I don't know what it is. Same thing is true for these guys, these Starbursts. Sorry about that, managed to knock my own microphone out. So same thing is true for these guys, these Starbursts, right? Quite nice lights, actually. They get some bad press, but I quite like them. But the DMX traits for this and the profile for this is typically set up so that it has a channel called rotation, which kind of makes sense to you and I. You know, we know what rotation means. W1 is like, no idea. If it's not pan and it's not tilt, I don't know what it is. So again, out of the box, the profile generally doesn't control these well. There's a couple of options you've got for these guys. The best one is to actually change the profile, because then you get some flexibility, which is what I've done. Probably a bit too complex for today. We'll talk about that on a different day. So, movement effects are you activate them here by hitting the move effects. I'm not going to cover this in massive detail because it's probably going to get quite complicated quite quickly. But you essentially got the same or similar kind of set of choices as color. So you've got things like an up and down movement. I don't know whether you can see this. I hope you can. So this is an up and down kind of move effect. Left and right, a circle, figure of 8 is quite nice. So that's the kind of your moving heads will effectively try and describe a figure of 8 pattern in the air. The genie lamp, that's like Aladdin on his magic carpet, so the lights tend to kind of bounce around in a kind of a magic carpet style duck swimming on water type movement. And then you've got the usual night fevers, conductor, and I'm not even going to go anywhere near the last one because that's a very cool step sequencer that allows you to create all sorts of your own custom effects. But if I choose something really simple like the circle for the moment, so don't forget here, I have no effects applied to any of my fixtures at the moment. You can see at the top, nothing is selected. The top row will show me if this effect is being applied to any of my groups. So I've got 6 groups, remember, A to F. There's no effect being applied. You'll notice I can't press pause because the W1 is intelligent enough to know that parkhands don't have pan and tilt. Right? There's no pan and tilt channel in any of my parkhands. So it'd be like, you can't switch on movement effects for pause because there's nothing for me to do. Moving spots has pan and tilt, so like, great, you could switch it on. And now, if I had moving spots connected, they would now be describing a kind of a circle pattern. Moving wash I could switch on. My barrel fixtures, in my case Warlocks and my whatever they're called, mini deckers, do have been set up to use a pan and tilt. I've deliberately adjusted the profile so that they use pan and tilt. If you've got those kind of fixtures and you're struggling to get them to do anything, then they're a slightly special case, so you're not alone. Do ask questions in the Facebook group because you should, we can definitely help you to get started with those. So barrels will work. If I switch to, you'll notice that my pin spots, my freedom sticks, neither of those have pan and tilt, so I can't switch them on. So, but for any given movement, again, you've got some control over the parameters. So speed, kind of obvious, is how fast they're moving. I didn't mention this on colours, but you can control speed by 3 different options. You can control it using the inbuilt timer. You can set a BPM, and you can also use sound active. The sound active on this box is pretty good. You can feed an audio input into the W1 so that it has, top quality audio coming straight in from your DJ controller. But I've never done that, and I've never needed to because it kind of works pretty well as it is. If you find that it's not working as well as you want it to, then by all means feed an audio in. But I never have. It's always worked really well. Just the built-in microphone on the W1. So that's speed, and you can control. You have an element of control over so how quickly your moving heads will move. There's loads of kind of little gotchas in here. So some people will notice that if they crank the speed right down, then sometimes their moving heads can move. Their movement can be quite jerky. That's not a fault of the W1. It's a kind of a combination of how your heads work and how the W1 works with it. Again, all these things can usually be sorted out. The same thing can also be true if you turn the speed right up, because believe it or not, the Wolfmix is probably much faster than your moving heads. So what that really means is that the Wolfmix here is sending way too many movement commands to your moving heads, and because they're mechanical devices, they physically cannot keep up. So yeah, just you need to find out what the limitations of your moving heads are. I know that some of mine, once you get into the kind of 75% speed, they just can't keep up. They physically cannot move fast enough to keep up. So what you end up with is a really random looking pattern because it's like, they just can't keep up. So be careful with the speed, play around with it, change one thing at a time and see how you get on. Phase is exactly the same as the way we discussed it with colour. So phase is like, do you want all of your heads to move completely in sync at the same position throughout the whole of the cycle? So don't forget, we've selected circle. So we would expect our moving heads to describe a circle. And do you want each head to be pointing at exactly the same position in the circle at the same time? If you change phase to be out of phase, what will happen is one will start at the, for example, one will start at the bottom, one will start at the top. So you'll end up with moving heads that do this. So they'll be perfectly in time, but essentially out of sync. And if you've got something like the figure of 8, so rather than 2 heads trying to draw the same figure of 8, I'm never going to do this, but you're going to end up with moving moving heads trying to describe a figure of 8 pattern, but out of sync, which creates a rather nicer effect. I bet if I go and look at the chat, you are laughing at my hopeless attempt to draw figure eights out of sync. Size. Oh, size is also really important because you're moving heads. Right. I'm just going to explain one thing here that loads of people forget. So, if once you introduce a DMX controller, if you're new to DMX, then this is one of the things that kind of baffles loads of people, because they wonder why does my moving head keep pointing at me behind my DJ booth? Why is it just not pointing at my dance floor? And you might even say, well, I've set up things like totem mode on my moving heads. Well, there are occasions, particularly with this particular fixture, where if you set totem mode, that's fine until you plug in a DMX cable, and that kind of overrides everything. So moving heads. Right, if this isn't stating the bleeding obvious, I'm really sorry. But moving heads, this moving head is capable of rotating. Let's see. So it can rotate almost. So that's one entire rotation, and then another 270 degrees. So that's a massive amount of rotation, right? You almost certainly do not want your head to be able to spin that much, and even if you could limit its rotation to being just point to the left and point to the right, so that's 180 degrees rotation out of the whatever it's. I mean, its full capacity like 540 degrees, I think it is. So even if you could limit it to this. This travel, you also want to make sure that you limit the tilt to just pointing down in front of you and then upwards, because if you don't do that, it's going to still be able to flip right over and shine in your face. So loads of people get rather stumped by this, and so setting limitations on moving heads is really, really important. And let's, in fact, should we just cover that now whilst we're at it? So if I go home, limitations are set in your actual fixture setup. So you need to go tap the fixtures icon on the top, go down to find heads. So here are two of mine. So I'm going to tap the two heads that I want to set limitations for, and you'll notice this little button, this little screen icon here, has lit up. And if I tap it, this will show me the limitation of this head. So the orange box is the travel for this particular head, and you might and I'm not surprised the box is that small, to be honest, because as you saw, that head can roll round almost twice and flip over 180 degrees, and I only ever really want it to travel to point down to the floor and up to the ceiling. I do not want it to flip over, so I wouldn't expect this box to extend right to the bottom. And I certainly don't want the head to spin round too far, so hence the overall size of this box is quite tiny. This is really important for moving heads. You can also use this to control other fixtures like barrels and mirrors that may kind of spin out of control. Right? If they use a pan channel and you find they're spinning wildly, you can use limitations to restrict that. But again, if you're running into those sorts of issues, bung something in the Facebook group and we'll help out. So setting limitations on moving heads is really important, because that stops them from spinning round or spinning over and pointing at you. So this moving head here is set up correctly. If you, I don't want to change it because it's right for me actually, but yeah, what you need to do here is change the kind of min pan and max pan using these two encoders, and a minimum tilt and maximum tilt using these two encoders. And then once you've got it about right, you can then stick your finger on here and actually drag this little icon around and inside the box, and your heads, if they're connected, will move, and you will find out if you have got it about right. So my top tip is, again here, is to set the limitations to what you think is right, and then literally just put your finger on the screen and drag this thing around. So I'm literally dragging it as far left as it will go, so you can see it will not allow me to go outside the box this side, it will not allow me to go outside the box this side, and you can see just how far your moving heads will actually move. That enables you to kind of test that your limitations are correct. Okay, we were talking about movement effects. We'll go back to them because movement effects, I'm going to go exit fixture setup, go back to move effects. The reason I went on that little tangent to talk about limitations is because size is affected by limitation. The limitations of your heads. So if you set size to 100%, that means that the heads will move as far left as they possibly can go, according to your limitations, and as far right as they can go, and they'll tilt up and down as far as the limitations will let them. So in other words, they'll cover the kind of maximum coverage of your room according to your limitations. If you set size to 50%. You're not going to get any prize for this because you probably worked out that that means that they will literally cover about half of the area. So rather than going from the center point all the way left, they'll go center point about halfway, and from the center point they'll go halfway the other way, and they'll tilt and pan. They'll tilt up and down about half of their full direction. So that's what size does. Quite useful. You can also click the size button to change fans. So if you've got some heads that will allow you to do that, you can set fan. It doesn't allow me to do. Oh, you can't do it on this particular effect. So this number 8 movement, you can't do that. You can on things like moving left and right. So rather than having your heads pointing directly ahead, you can set fans so that even though that they're both if you've got two heads, they're both pointing forwards, they can be fanned slightly apart so that when they move, they're still not pointed dead ahead. Does that make sense? Kind of did in my head. Fade, again, is all about how movements fade. That's really hard to explain how that works. You probably just want to play with that again. I've tried this, and I genuinely can't remember how I got it to work actually. So I'm gonna have to go and do some homework. But for this again, set up your heads, click one of the effects, apply it to like a single group. So if you've got 2 spots in a single group, just activate this movement effect just for one group, and then just watch and see what those 2 heads do. Okay, play around with each one of these. So play around with like the number 8, or play around with the magic carpet, and then once you start to kind of get a feel for the movement effects and what they do, that's when you can then start to experiment to saving them as a preset, because at some point you're going to create, as I said, you're going to create a whole scene that you think, right, I've got my park hands doing what I want them to do, I've got my heads doing what I want them to do, I've got my barrels doing what I want them to do. I kind of want to save that scene so that I can instantly recall it and not have to go and change all of these settings just to get back to where I was. And that's essentially what preset does. But movement effects, I say, really important is that you set limitations so they just your heads or whatever just don't go wild and spin everywhere, and then play around with each of these effects just to get a feel for what they do. Understand what speed does. Understand what phase does. Order is another thing you can change. You can affect the you can change the order in which movement is applied. Hard to explain, and it's not always obvious if you've only got 2 heads, for example. If you've got 4 heads or 8 heads on a truss, order would suddenly become really obvious, because you see, okay, so I've got all of my heads doing something, and they're doing it kind of in, but they're not doing it in a kind of a sequence. You could see some heads moving in one direction while others are moving in the opposite direction. So order is how the effect is applied to multiple moving heads. Not always obvious if you've only got 2. So very often at small gigs, I only take 2 moving heads with me, sit them on the front of my booth. You just don't see any change if you change the order, because, well, why would you? You've only got 2, so One's going to either follow the other or it will run ahead of it, and it won't appear to be any different. But as I said, go and have a play around with these. The buttons, you might be wondering what these do, and I've not played with these for ages. But this determines, I think, where the center point of the movement is. But I'm not entirely sure. I'm going to have to go and have a play around with that. But I have a feeling this controls the center point of the actual movement. So I think, from memory, from reading the manual a long time ago, I think that's what it is. But do go and have a read the manual. Yeah, please don't think you can get away with not reading the manual for this, because everything that I've told you is in there somewhere. It's just it's kind of one of those things where if someone explains something and then you go back and read it in the manual, it then kind of makes sense. But yeah, everything I've said is in the manual. It is really good. You can get it from wolfmix.com. And I would wholeheartedly recommend that you go and have a read of it, because it's all there. Right, so that's movement effects. So if I go back to my home screen, so now remember now that with no effects applied, my paths should be that static color that I selected. My moving heads should be at the position that I'd selected, and they should be showing the gobo that I'd selected, not moving. And if I choose then to apply movement effects to my moving spots, they should start moving according to the current movement effect that I'd selected. And if I then add moving wash into the equation, they should also start to follow that same movement pattern. I've also got barrels here, so I could add 3 of them. So what I've now done is applied movement effects to those 3 groups. So that's all I've done. Color-wise, don't forget there's no color effects selected, so they're just set at the static color that I'd previously chosen. If I go back to my home screen and then start applying color effects to these as well, that means my park hands still on that static color, right? Can't remember what it was, pink. So my park hands are on pink, but my moving spots, my moving wash, and my barrels are now doing what the color effects has told them to do, which was, in this case, I'm going to switch it back to the way it was, which is the kind of the rainbow fade, fairly slow, 15%, fading between pink, green, and white. So, and you can see that the 3 groups that are being affected by this, because they're lit at the top, and the 3 buttons are lit here as well. If I want my pars to do the same thing as well, so if I want my pars to be green, pink, white, and cyan, I just add them in as well, and now they should all of my fixtures should all be doing the same thing. Literally, they should. So if my par cans fade to blue, my moving wash should fade to I don't know. Sorry, not blue, cyan. My moving spots will be on a. They can't fade, right? Because there's a color wheel can't fade from green to blue, but it will change. And several people have asked questions about how that happens and how you create a fade. That's more complicated. Stick that in the questions, and we'll cover that in the group somehow. But essentially, what's going to happen is when my par cans eventually fade from say pink to white, my moving heads with a color wheel will change from green to white. So I've essentially said all my fixtures should be affected by the color effects, and hence you can see from the home screen which fixtures or which groups. So the groups, follow the groups down in terms of the pads. You can see which fixtures are being affected by each effects rack. So I've got colours across the board and then movements on these 3. And if I turn them all off, that means no effects being applied at all. They'll return to their default position, which is this colour at this position with this gobo. And that is probably about as much as you're going to need to get started and hopefully make some sense of what the Wolfmix does. So if I go back to the DMX layers, and stick that back on the screen again. So just to remind you then, so at the top we said there's a default set of DMX values, which then after which is applied. I'm going to ignore DMX in because I've got nothing that's telling my Wolfmix what to do from outside. So sets the gobo, sets the static color, then applies a color effect for each group if that group has the color effects turned on, and then we're into things like group and master dimmers, and you'll see those on the home screen at the bottom here. So you then have an amount of control over the dimmer for each group as well. This is quite useful. So if, for example, my moving wash are a bit bright and those Equinox Vortexes are flipping bright, you'll notice, if you can just about see it, I've turned the dimmer on those down to 75%, right? Because they're just too bright at 100%. So if they're still too bright in a room, I can crank it right down to like 50%. So this group is now running at a 50% dimmer. So you can see this stack, this diagram that I bet everyone glosses over when they first read the manual. This stack is really important because it tells you what happens and when. So the group and master dimmers are applied, and then you're into these flash buttons on the right hand side, which kind of override everything. If you haven't hit these already, go and have a play with them, because they do create some pretty spectacular effects. Strobe, pretty obvious. Blinder just turns everything white. So anything that can turn white will turn white and go poof, and just blind your audience or dance floor. Speed, cover that later, because that allows you to take any effect that's running and crank the speed of it. You think, why would you do that? Well, you know, when you're if you've ever mixed any kind of dance tracks, and you set a loop at 16 bars, then you drop it to 8, and then you drop it to 4, you drop it to 2, drop it to 1, and then you go boom and you hit a drop. That's kind of doing the opposite thing with lighting. That's how that works. I have done it, actually. It's pretty cool. So if you, although it's flipping hard to do it with your controller on one hand and your Wolfmix on the other, but it is possible. So that's what speed does. Blackout, really obvious, just turns everything off. And you can. I've also got mine set to toggle. So when I hit blackout, it will stay on. If you tap this little encoder here, it will be on. You'd have to. Oh, sorry, no, that's right. You have to turn it. So if you turn the encoder to be a flash, it will literally black out when I'm pressing, blackout off when I release. So that's fine if you want to do a short blackout in a room. But if you've just done a kind of a surprise birthday party and you want all your lights to be off until surprise party guest arrives, you can switch it to be switch blackout to be on toggle, and then it will just, all your lights will stay blacked out until person walks in the room, boom, hit it once, wow, all the lights come back on. So that's blackout. Smoke will fire a smoke machine. So there's a couple of things I haven't covered. My computer power supply has dropped out. That's annoying. Let's go and plug that back in, otherwise it's going to die quite soon. Oh, it's alive. How are we doing for questions? I want my fixtures, say par cans, to strobe at full power when they are usually at 30%. Without going and reading the manual, I don't know how to do that, actually. Did I mention that I'm not an expert? I'll have to go and have a look. I don't know whether you can do that. I know that Blinder, I'm pretty sure, forces all lights to 100%, but I'll have to go and check how you can set strobe to do that. I don't know whether you can. Any other questions? Can you show us how to save that show? Yes. Okay. So all of the changes that I've made here will actually remain in place even if I pull the power supply out of the back of this W1. It's kind of got non-volatile memory that just remembers exactly the state it was. So if you unplug it and you plug it back in again, it remembers the state. That said, it's always a good idea to save any scenes you like as a preset, and it's also a really good idea at some point to back up any projects that you've got to your laptop. We're never going to get to cover that today because I've now realised I've been waffling for at least an hour. Blimey. How do you save a preset? You simply tap the preset button, and you've got 5 pages of presets here. And this particular project I've set up as quite a noddy little one, for almost as a bit of a demo here. You've got 5 pages, so the right-hand encoder allows you to switch between 5 pages, so you can have loads. And I just quickly earlier on just created 2. So my first dance, if I tap first dance to recall it, this should return all of my settings to the way I want them. So if my color, if I go to color, they should be on pink. This one should be on magenta. The position should be set to floor. Gobo should be set to hearts because that's my first dance. I don't use warlocks very much. And you'll notice that the color effects for pars is on. And if I look at color effects, it's set to my rainbow and it's just pink and blue. Okay, if I go and mess this up completely, and then go back to hit preset and go to first dance, hit color effects, see, it's gone back to being just the colors that I saved as part of that preset. So how do you save something as a preset? All you do is you can either overwrite a preset that's already there, or you can pick one that's essentially not in use. So if I want to save this setup here as preset 5, I literally hold the shift key and I tap preset 5. Okay, I give it a name. So I'm going to call this something like demo, or well, if I could type, that would be a really good thing. Demo. Okay. Bum bum. Preset. Oh crikey. Anyway, excuse my crap typing. So you give it a name, you hit the tick, and it's now saved. The name appears on the button, and it will even try and show you some of the colours that are included. It won't show you all of them. If you selected loads, it won't show all of them. And so if I then go to, if I tap another preset, that I can either tap the word dancing here, or I can press the kind of associated pad on the screen. So if I press the pad here, it goes to first dance, go to the second one, it's dancing. So you'll notice here, if I go by dancing, I go to home screen, I've got things like movement effects on. If I look at color effects, you see I've got a whole range of colors. I've literally got red, green, blue, pink, amber, bit of a, oh, for goodness sake. How many times am I going to pull my own headphone socket out? Let's go and work out a way of not doing that. So I can. This has got a whole different range of color effects being applied. If I go to preset again, so I can switch back to first dance, and you'll notice here that go back to home. So the only color effects that's being applied here is on my pars. Barrels has got it switched on. Bit weird. I might come and show you how to remove that in a minute. But no color effects is being applied, or no movement effects is being applied to my moving spots. And so what does that mean? Well, that was right at the top of this session when I said if there's no movement effects being applied, then that means this moving head will be pointing at the floor, okay, in terms of its kind of default position. And if you want to see where its default position is, you press shift and the button, and it will show you where its default position is. And you press shift and the button to return. So understanding that layered rack is really important, because it kind of hopefully starts to make some sense of what a default position looks like, and then how a color effect and or a movement effect is applied to your moving heads or your pars or whatever. So presets are really easy to save and retrieve. Literally, so if you just press the button, it will select that preset and remove any other settings that you previously had set. If you want to actually store a preset, hold the Shift key and then press the dancing or press the button. So I mentioned over here on this preset, first dance, that I had color effects switched on, which I probably certainly don't want. So if I turn it off here, go to my preset, I can literally override that now by holding the Shift key, pressing the first dance, hitting the save, and now if I go to preset and choose dancing, you'll see they're all on. And if I go to preset and choose first dance, that color effects that was previously applied is no longer saved as part of that preset. In fact, it's saved as being off. Right. Okay. What else do I need to cover? Right, let me answer a few other questions, because I'm surprised no one's asked yet, and they may have done, but I didn't see it. It's like, how do you set prism? I've got lamps that have got prism. I've got things like those vortex that can spin. How do you set the spin? There's nothing on here that can set spin. So if you look at this layer diagram again, which I now realise I've left on screen, you'll notice that after anything like blackouts applied, any group flash, any blinder, any strobe, any smoke, after all of those things have applied, you then get to live edits. And you might go, well, what the heck is a live edit? Now, live edits are the absolute saviour in terms of controlling a fixture that isn't pan, tilt, RGB, colour wheel. Right? If your fixture's got something else that you want to control and you don't know how to do it, live edits is the way to do it, because live edits is right down there near the bottom of the stack, because they get kind of overlaid on top of everything else that your Wolfmix W1 is telling your lights to do. So you might have, let me just grab a little drink here because I can feel my throat going dry. So you've got something like these, I won't show them, moving heads. They have a prism. How do you switch prism on? Well, there's no button in on any of these settings here that allow you to enable a prism. So how do you enable a prism? Well, what you do is you create a very specific live edit that will change the DMX values for that channel on those lights only. Okay, it's not going to change any other channels on any other lights. It's specific. You choose the lights that you want to change. So let's say, for example, I'll create a new live edit. I'm going to create a brand new one here. So I'm going to press Shift and choose an empty slot for a live edit. I'm going to look for the fixtures that I want to change. So I'm going to go for, let's go for my, I'm looking, have I got it on here? I thought I'd chosen, I've one of my fixtures on here, which is a, no, I haven't. Right, I'm going to choose the Ninja Zoom. Right, Ninja Zoom is this thing here. If you can see it, you probably can't see it. Let's turn off the, let's turn this off. Right, so this is a Ninja Zoom. It's like a pin spot for a mirror ball, but you can change the zoom angle on this. So if I want to be able to change the zoom angle, or if I had a spot that like a gobo projector which had gobo rotation, or for example, you can do that. You can select more than one. It wouldn't make any sense to do it in here, but you can select more than one fixture, and then you tap the Edit One button, and it says, okay, for